Thank you very much, Tamar. We are going to be discussing Shmita, indeed, and this is the culmination, actually, of the previous 3 sessions. Where are we holding? We were talking about the borders. Where do we observe the land-based mitzvot? We talked about Orla, which is all about the fruit, and halacha Moshe Sinai is a mitzvah everywhere in the world. We talked about Kilayim, which is actually, the onus is on the farmer. And according Midrabanan, the mitzvah of Kilayim is everywhere in the world, not just in Israel. Shmita is different. It both combines everything about the plant and about the farmer, but it's only in the land of Israel. The only other place I have encountered Shmita trying to be observed was in California, but California is different. When, where, and how do we observe Shmita? So these are pictures taken at Beit 2 Shmitot ago. This is from Kibbutz Chafetz Chaim, 1 Shmita ago. You can see that in Beit they had already, before Rosh Hashanah of Shmita, sowed wheat in order to have a crop during the 7th year. We'll discuss how that is a possibility. Every 6 years, says the Torah, you stop what you're doing. 6 years you sow your field, 6 years you prune your vineyard, gather its fruits. The 7th year is Shabbat. Shabbat Shabbaton for the land, also for the farmer. You can't sow your field, you're not supposed to prune your vineyard, you shouldn't reap things that grow by themselves or harvest grapes that grew of themselves. It should be a solemn rest for the land, it says in the Torah. Now there are 2 approaches to this. How much of this is a mitzvah? According to Rambam, the resting of the land shall provide food for you, it says in the Torah. Rambam does not say that eating the fruit of the land that appears during Shemitah is a mitzvah. Ramban, Nachmanides, on the other hand, who lived some 60, 70 years after Rambam, they actually overlapped, says that it is a mitzvah to eat the land, the fruit of the land. How do we resolve this? It's actually rather simple. Rambam was a tourist. He came to Eretz Yisrael once, perhaps twice, went back home to Egypt. Ramban made aliyah. Ramban lived in the land. His view was that the land is holy and the food that it produces is holy, and it's a mitzvah to eat this holy food. Jubilee. 7 times 7, 49 years, says the Torah. Every 7th Shemitah, you sound the trumpet, and you do that even on Yom Kippur. You consecrate the 50th year, and Americans among the audience will recognize this pasuk. Proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all its inhabitants thereof, as it says on the Liberty Bell, located in Philadelphia. So it should be a jubilee for you, but we don't do jubilee anymore, because it turns out 2 Shmitot in a row, 2 years of Shemitah in a row, are hard on the farmer. And after the Churban Beit Rishon, after the destruction of the first temple, it was already not observed. So when exactly does all of this happen? How do we calculate, how do we know what year Shemitah is of the 7 cycles? There's some historical references. Beit Shan is a very large archaeological location in the northern part of the Jordan River Valley. And you can see that many of these columns are actually falling in the same direction. This was not done by man, this was done by nature. The ones that were set up here were done by archaeologists and those interested in inviting tourists. So there was an earthquake, and it's called the Shmita earthquake. Further evidence, better evidence even, is in Gamla, on the other side of the valley from Beit Shan, and here we see that these all fell in the same direction. It's an indication of how the rift worked. The Rift Valley is a very active geotectonic area. We are due for another earthquake. Please God, it should happen in some time when everything and everybody will be safer than they were at Gamla or Beit Shan. However, there was an earthquake in the year of Shmita, 749 CE. It says on the 23rd of Shvat, there's a fast for the land of Israel. It's called Tzom Hara'ash, the fast of the earthquake. And it says in the introduction to the keynote, to the lamentations that are said for this earthquake, you march through the earth in fury, beza'am. You thrash the nations in anger, says the Navi Habakkuk. How do we figure out what year this happened? In Gematria, Mem Sofit is 600, Ayin is 70, Zion is 7, and Beit is 2. Together, that adds up to 679. Subtract from the time that the city of Jerusalem, the Beit HaMikdash HaSheni, was destroyed, and we get an even number. Divide any current year in the Hebrew calendar by 7, you'll get the Shmita calendar. For example, now it's 5784. Divide that by 7, you get 826 plus 2. Right now, it's the second year of the Shmita cycle. It's an easy way of figuring out where we are in relationship to Shmita. Let's get back to the earthquake. It happened a little bit north of Yericho, whose walls had already come tumbling down, but it destroyed Beit Shan, it destroyed Gamla, which is up near Katzrin, and there is evidence that it also destroyed many buildings in Yerushalayim, all because of that Ra'ash HaShmita, the Shmita earthquake. But there's even earlier evidence for maintaining the Shmita calendar. Down here, southeast of the Dead Sea, there's a place called Tzoar, sometimes referred to as Tzoara. This is a general map, and in the Madama map, which I've introduced previously, is located from the 6th century. Tzoar is also located southeast of the end of the Dead Sea. Tzoar was the southernmost and easternmost location where Jews lived. It was a mixed community. By the time of the Common Era, there were many Christians there. There were also many Jews there. The Jewish gravestones, which were preserved in the dry climate of Tzoar, have interesting inscriptions. It says here, this is the tombstone of Hannah, the daughter of Hani, possibly the priest, who died on the Shabbat of the first festival day of Pesach, in the 5th year of the sabbatical cycles. The 38 Tzoar gravestones that have been deciphered, of a few hundred that exist, it turns out that this counting of the 5th year of the sabbatical cycle is actually correct. The year works out to be 438, 439. When you divide by 7, you actually get 62 with a remainder of 5, and it's the 5th year of the sabbatical cycle. More evidence that you can actually calculate when the Shmita year is. Rambam did keep count. He said that Shmita is a mitzvah. He just said that eating the food that is produced during Shmita is not a mitzvah. And by his time, which was in the middle of the 12th century, he said that this is 1,107 years since the destruction of the temple, and we use these calculations not only for discussing Shmita, but also what year it is in the cycle of tithing, and also in forgiving debts. So what's a Jew not to do in the case of Shmita? There's forbidden agricultural work. You shouldn't sow your field, you shouldn't prune your vineyard. We've read that pasuk already. Let's summarize it. In the field, no sowing, planting, or harvesting, called katsir in Hebrew. In the vineyard, no pruning or harvesting. Harvesting for the vineyard is called batsir. Hebrew has many nouns that are very specific to crops. It's a bit more rich in its vocabulary in that respect than English is as far as agriculture goes. So the pasuk says that 6 days you shall work, on the 7th day you shall rest. That's referring to Shabbos. On the other hand, it then says both at plowing time and at harvest you shall rest. Says the Tosefta in Shvi'it, obviously, we're not talking about Shabbos, we're talking about Shmita. And we're talking about adding a little bit more to the Shmita year, as we do to Shabbos, where we have 18 minutes before and at least 42 minutes after Shabbat, before sunset and after sunset. In the same way, they said, let's have an extension on the sabbatical year. Turns out, the nation, the people could not take it. And Rabban Gamliel in his court said, okay, we're not going to have Tosefet Shvi'it anymore. They permitted working the land until Rosh Hashanah. Let's look a little bit at what is the benefit of Shmita. Now, the benefit of Shmita is that it's a holy year and that we observe it as such. However, here's an example of a more practical aspect of Shmita. Nematodes are tiny worms that live in the soil and harm plants. And you see here some carrots that are not looking happy at all as a result of infection by nematodes. The nematode population can reach, let's say, relative number, we'll call it 100%. You have Shmita, no sowing of crops, nothing for the nematodes to eat, the population crashes by the end of the first year. It rebuilds over the 2nd through 5th years, and by the 6th year, there's a pretty healthy crop of nematodes in your healthy crop of vegetables and grains. Comes Shmita again, it goes down. Actually, this is part of the principle of crop rotation, that you remove what it is that the local bugs want to eat, and therefore their population will go down. And this is something that's been done for hundreds of years, thousands of years actually. It's a way of managing the land to get adequate food. But Shmita, we say, is about forbidden agricultural activity. We'll find out soon enough that there's other activity aside from agricultural. Midoraita, from the Torah, sowing or planting, pruning, harvesting crops or harvesting grapes are all forbidden. Plowing is also forbidden from the Torah, but the punishment is not as bad as it is for these. We're not going to talk about the punishments now. Midirabanan, from rabbinical injunction, we cannot irrigate and we cannot fertilize. But it's not that we can't irrigate altogether, that we can't fertilize altogether. We can maintain the crops, as we will see shortly. What is produced during Shmita, if you have a fruit tree, the fruit is going to appear anyway, but that fruit is officially ownerless. The tree is not, the fruit is. Commercial activity is forbidden. You can't precisely weigh or price according to the season when there's a shortage of fruit and you happen to have some. You can't raise the price if you have Shmita produce, and you can't weigh it down to the last gram or 100 grams. You can't waste it. You can't turn it into compost. It's considered wasting it. You can't throw it out in the garbage, officially. And you can't play games with the stuff. You can't play catch with a lemon that has kedushat shvi'it, that has the sanctity of Shmita. You can't do unusual uses either, cucumber shampoo or fried grapes. These are exaggerations, obviously, but you can't do something that is not usually done with the crop. How do we know when the holiness of the crop starts? This is a picture of shesek, also known as loquat in Hebrew, shesek. And any bracha, we'll start with the fruit. Any bracha, borei pri ha'etz, on the fruit, begins after the fruit formation. If you say borei pri ha'etz, when the fruit forms determines whether it has the sanctity of Shmita or not. If it forms during Shmita. The first fruit of the season that usually has the sanctity of Shmita is the shesek, the loquat. It's usually ripe somewhere February, March. It forms as early as December. The last fruit that will have kedushat shvi will be citrus, which will be available for harvest only in the 8th year, but they will have formed in the 7th year, and therefore they will also have kedushat shvi'it, that sanctity. The very, very last things that still have sanctity would be juices, preserves, frozen, canned goods that can last into the 8th, 9th, 10th year. Wine, for example. We'll discuss wine shortly. Going back, borei pri ha'adama, the bracha you make on vegetables, it goes by the harvest. If your vegetable, let's say your cucumber vine, was established in the 6th year, and you harvested all the way up to Rosh Hashanah for the salad for the first day of Rosh Hashanah, you harvested it before candle lighting, that is officially from the 6th year. From the very same vine, if you harvest something on the 3rd of Tishrei, because the 2nd of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah, and you should not be harvesting then that will have the sanctity of Shmita. You can't plant the cucumber during Shmita, but you can use the fruit, but it will have the sanctity of Shvi'it. So there have been many, 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 add a few more many, books and pamphlets written about what can we do during Shmita. This one was written by Harav Ze'ev Weizmann, who is the Rav Harashi of Tnuva. It's into its 3rd edition now. Basically, what we're trying to do is figure out how to maintain our fields, how to maintain our orchards, how to maintain production for the 8th year during the 7th year. Agricultural activities that maintain a plant are permitted, but those activities that improve the plant's condition are not permitted, as it says in Masechet Avodah Zarah. What's the bottom line? Shmita in our time is of rabbinic origin because the Jews are not all settled in the land according to their tribal nachalot, according to their tribal locations. Rambam, and later on the Vilna Gaon, said that there is legal ownership of the land of Israel for a non-Jew. Non-Jews can buy the land, and that will remove the sanctity of the land. We will discuss heter mechira very shortly. So it is appropriate that we can rely on the lenient ruling of the Beit Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch, regarding rabbinic laws. Now here is where a translation by ChatGPT fell down. I kept it in just to show you that you shouldn't rely on anybody or anything. And it said here, the ruling of the Beit Yosef, this has been the custom. But that's a mistranslation. What it really should have said is only as rabbinic authorities of the time agree. And it goes, in every generation, rabbinic authorities will have an opinion on how to observe mitzvot, including Shmita. We go according to what was in the past, but we also go according to what is in the present, and always with an eye on the future. Let's just mention a few rabbinic mitzvot. When people say, it's midrabanan, it's done with mitzvah of the rabbis, we don't really have to observe it. Well, what are these rabbinic mitzvot? Saying Hallel is a rabbinic mitzvah. It's not found in the Torah. Same thing with reading Megillah, putting up an Eruv. Saying brachot altogether is not found in the Torah, except for saying a bracha after we eat. Candle lighting, not found in the Torah, it's midrabanan. Same thing with washing hands that people do before they have bread. Where does a Jew not do the mitzvah? What is the location of Shmita? We've already discussed the borders. Let's talk about mostly the southern borders. But we'll talk about, the reason we're talking about the southern borders is because although the northern part of Israel, many say that it was conquered by Joshua the first time that the Bnei Israel entered the land, it was not conquered at the return from Babylon with Ezra and his buddies. Nonetheless, for historical, geopolitical reasons, nobody says that the northern part of Israel these days is not halachically part of Eretz Yisrael for observing the mitzvot. Everybody tends to agree that the section of Otef Aza, which is so much in the news, alas, these days, is not part of Eretz Yisrael currently. I emphasize currently. Here is Tzoar, and you can see that it is indeed the easternmost part of Eretz Yisrael, if you draw the line of the border. And here are various rabbinic interpretations of where the southern border is, ranging from somewhere near Ein Yahav to all the way down to Eilat, over here, depending on the rabbinic authority. Most people say, draw the line here, between Eretz Madar and Kibbutz Lotan. There is, however, that western boundary where it is possible to draw a line from just a little bit southwest of Ashkelon down to Kadesh Barnea and say that to the east of that, that's Olei Bavel. That's where Ezra and his fellows came and retook the land. West of that is Olei Mitzrayim, where only people who came out of Egypt took over that land. And therefore, there are those who say that in that western region, which includes the area which is mostly the breadbasket and a good deal of the vegetables, certainly the ground vegetables, the carrots and potatoes of the state of Israel, that there you only have to observe the Torah mitzvot of Shmita, and that certain activities are permitted during Shmita that otherwise would be forbidden by Rabbanan. Those activities are forbidden east of the line. And here we see some rabbis who are cleverly disguised. They are crossing the Jordanian border, and they are going to go inspect fruits and vegetables that are growing east of the Jordan River, east of the border with Jordan, and they're being grown for Shmita-conscious consumers. This is 2 Shmitot ago. Let's get a consumer guide to Shmita observance. Try to set things straight here. Fruit that was produced in the 6th year, if the tree blossomed or if the vegetables were planted, you can eat it during Shmita. It is not going to be asur. Non-Jewish produce, which applies even in the land of Israel, with or without the sanctity of the sabbatical year, is also permitted. Produce from outside the land, with a capital L, that's the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, which is not necessarily outside the country, and this usually specifically refers to the southern Arava, produce from there will also be permitted to be eaten, according to most authorities, during Shmita. And then there's hydroponics, where you're not connected to the soil of the land of Israel at all, as long as it's under a roof and is distinct and discreetly separated from anything to do with the land. Now, there are two ways of approaching this altogether. There's the heter mechira, which is a legal fiction. And as we'll see soon, there are many legal fictions, even in our very legalistic Judaic religion. Produce that does not have the sanctity of the sabbatical year, and you're allowed to plant in the ground based on this halachic dispensation. Or otzar Beit Din, a way of gathering all the produce that does have the sanctity of the sabbatical year. You don't plant in the ground, but there is a means of distribution that involves commerce. So let's talk about non-Eretz Yisrael produce first. Here is an overview of Kibbutz Yotvata, southern Arava. Over there is something growing during the Shemitah year, and since it's south of the border of Eretz Yisrael, but in the land, in the state of Israel, it is permitted according to almost all rabbinic authorities. Stuff that comes from outside the land altogether, with the land with a capital L. Vegetables, so cut and whole Belgian carrots, and here is a gigantic Belgian carrot growing wild and about to be taken on a bicycle. Or produce produced by non-Jews in the land of Israel. Strawberries are grown in Kalansoa, in central Israel. It used to be that Arab farmers were responsible for more than 50% of production of squash and at least 20% of the cucumbers. Those figures are changing these days, but there is still a large amount of standard produce that you find in the market that is produced under non-Jewish auspices. But you should really check to make sure that that is really the case when it comes to Shmita. So what is this selling the land? Well, it's actually common in our religion. We sell our mitzvot. We sell chametz for Pesach. The pasuk says, no chametz shall be seen, but we sell our chametz and we put it away in a closet, and we sure know where that closet is. Or heter iska, if you loan money to the poor, you can't charge them interest, but through a legal fiction called heter iska, you put money in the bank lends that money to other people, they pay interest, and you get part of that interest on your savings account. If you keep it in your checking account, you don't. Bechorot, it's a mitzvah that the firstborn male animal is offered to Hashem. By selling the trachea and the windpipe of the mother of the firstborn, of a prima partum cow, or goat even, then that animal is no longer a Jewish, the animal that she gives birth to is no longer a Jewish-owned animal, and you can avoid having to give that animal up to Hashem. And finally, prosbul. The pasuk in Deuteronomy says, this is the essence of Shmita. Forgive debts. This is Shmita for Hashem. But what do? We cancel it. But as it says in Masechet Shvi'it, prosbul does not really annul debts. It was instituted by Hillel the elder, who was before the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, when he saw that people refrained from lending to one another before Shemitah, because they said they weren't going to get their money back. And then it says in the pasuk, though, beware lest you think that, you're not going to lend because Shemitah is coming and you're not going to get your money back. So Hillel instituted the prosbul, which says, I hand over to you, judges in a Beit Din, any debt that I may have so that it can be collected. It doesn't belong to an individual, it belongs to a committee. It belongs to the larger set of people, and therefore it will be permitted to do that. Isn't prosbul accepted by everybody? Certainly it is. But not necessarily when it comes to selling the land. Selling your debts, yes. Selling your economic responsibilities, yes. Selling your land, not so much. And here are different ways. Rashi says that prosbul, the word comes from prosebuli, rich and poor people together. It probably more likely comes from the Greek of handing your debt over to, or prosbule, before a council, before a va'ad, before a Beit Din. Because ultimately, poverty will not pass from the land, so you have to give charity to your brother, who in this case is going to be a farmer. And why is that? Because the farmer is prohibited from farming in the 7th year. He's not going to have an income. The Torah obligated the wealthy lender, patoach et yadcha, open your hand, give your farmer, the one who is feeding you, money. And then it says that the farmer does not have to repay the debt. So there is a balance here. Now, Hillel the Elder lived in a time of King Herod, Hordus, around 50 BCE, as I said, before the destruction of the temple, 100 and plus years before that. At that time, trade was going more towards goods and not so much toward the agricultural sector. And there was no reason to lighten the burden on merchants because of Shmita, as their incomes weren't affected during that year. But Hillel was worried for the farmers, and rightly so, because you had to get food. The power of uninformed chumrah. Now we know that we're not supposed to plant, and we know we're not supposed to irrigate, and we know that we're not supposed to fertilize. And the Rebbetzin of Vizhnitz, so I heard 30 years ago, had a garden. Actually, she had plants on her windowsill, and she had plants around the house, and she was very, very worried. What I don't know is which Rebbetzin of Vizhnitz that was. I used to think that it was the one over here, Rabbanit Sheindel Hagar, and then I realized that there was a previous Rebbetzin who the Rebbe had married twice. Not at the same time, don't think that. Anyhow, she was concerned about Shmita. She didn't want to have plants possibly benefiting by being next to a window and getting something from the outside of the land of Israel inside her house and benefiting. So she took all her houseplants and she threw them underneath the staircase, and it was a little bit light, and she would every now and then sprinkle some water in there, not to irrigate so much. And she never had such a bountiful set of houseplants. Why? Because finally, she wasn't burning them by having them next to the glass of the window where it acts as a magnifying glass for the sun. Finally, she was not overwatering her plants and drowning the roots, and they would get weak and lose leaves. Finally, they actually had decent conditions during Shmita, and they thrived. So, the power of uninformed chumrah, it's a good thing. It is okay to maintain a plant, but you can't improve it, as I've mentioned. So you can use slow-release fertilizer before the start of Shmita. You can do maintenance irrigation. If you irrigate only 70%, water only 70% of what you usually do, your plant will come through fine, probably even better. Spraying something to take care of fungi or bugs is okay to save a yield or a plant. The same thing with pruning. You mow the lawn, you leave the grass a little bit longer than usual, not as often, it'll be okay. You don't want to have snakes though, so you have to keep it back. You can cut back the flowers, but not to induce more. You can rake up weeds. You can also dig in the land as long as you're building something. You can't make a garden, but you can build walls, and you can dig a cellar, etc. Back to the Rebbetzins. Benign neglect is sometimes a good thing. If you don't overly deal with your houseplants, chances are they will reward you by looking even better. Heter mechira. What is that? So we see here two kinds of potato chips. One of them is the hashgachat, the badatz of the Eidah Charedit of Yerushalayim. And it says, Yivul chul, made with potatoes that came from Chutz La'aretz. I remind you that Chutz La'aretz could be still within the state of Israel in the southern Arava. These were made by heter mechira. These were probably made from potatoes that were grown in the northern part, or the majority of the state of Israel, also the land of Israel. And therefore, they were according to the heter. What is this heter? How does it work? You say, in the pasuk, in Vayikra, it predicts that we're going to complain. What do we eat? We don't sow, we don't gather our produce. Hashem says, the 6th year, you'll get produce for 3 years. For the 6th year, for the 7th year, and for the 8th year, the first year of the next Shmita cycle, so that you will have something to start to eat while you are growing things for a yield later on in that year. What are the principles of heter mechira? First of all, Shmita these days is mid'Rabbanan. It's not mid'oraisa. We don't have all of the land. Not all the Jews are in the land. It's not all Eretz Yisrael, and therefore it's mid'Rabbanan. As I pointed out, just because it's mid'Rabbanan doesn't mean that it's something we can wave our hands and say, no, that doesn't count. It counts, it counts. But the principle is that there's no kedushat shvi'it, there's no sanctity of the produce from land that belongs to a non-Jew. And the land has been sold to a non-Jew, as we will discuss soon. The non-Jew's ownership invalidates the land's holiness. And you can sell the land to the non-Jew to benefit the Jew, but the sale is for 2 years, because we don't want to be so obvious, so brutally crushing a mitzvah to sell it just for that specific year of Shmita. The land is actually sold with a down payment only for the 7th year and the 1st year of the 2nd cycle. And all agree that heter mechira is a temporary stopgap until Mashiach comes, or even earlier if all of Bnei Yisrael finally come to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, and settle. Heter mechira was not something invented only in the late 19th century. The Jews of Tzfat in 1520, after they had got permission from the Turks to settle back in the land of Israel, and these were all people who had left the Iberian Peninsula, either Spain or Portugal. So the Mabit, Moshe ben Yosef Ditrani, he said, we can sell the land. He sold it for 2 years. Because of land taxes, they had to produce something, otherwise they would lose their land altogether. So they had to sow during Shmita. 80 years later, Rav Moshe Galanti, also in Tzfat, said that northern lands of Israel were only from Olei Mitzrayim, not Olei Bavel, as I pointed out to you in a map. 150 years after that, Reb Mordechai Rubio, known as the Shemen Hamor, he sold his vineyard officially. It was worked by a non-Jew. Hebron, even then, had a substantial Arab population, but it also had a substantial Jewish population. And he sold his vineyard. I guess it was used for grape juice, because a Muslim, of course, will not drink wine. And everything was fine. So there's a long history of heterei mechira. And he said, Reb Mordechai Rubio, the Shemen Hamor, in saying, lo techanem, don't be nice, don't allow people who are not Jewish to have a purchase in the land. It's not relevant, because if we invent a takana for this problem, he called it a problem, but I always say it's not a problem, it's a mitzvah. Don't view mitzvot as problems. View them as something to observe. How you observe it? Well, you could do it mid'Rabbanan, you could do it mid'Oraita. Anyway, he says, every God-fearing person will flee rather than purchase a landholding if you have to sell your land or you have to stop growing every 7 years. People will not make aliyah. He was saying that already 400 years ago. Nowadays, we're aware that there are opposing views of heter mechira versus non-heter mechira, but heter mechira was promoted by Harav Kook, Avram Yitzchak Kohen Kook. His great nephew was Simcha Kohen Kook, who passed away a few short years ago. How was the land sold? In the Shmita, they sold the land temporarily to a non-Jew, as had been done ever since the 1500s. Later on, somebody said, no, we don't want to sell all the land. Let's just sell the tree with its required soil for growth. That was done one Shmita. It turned out not to be a workable solution. So ever since the late 1800s, or the early 1900s, I should say, the land is sold temporarily to a non-Jew. This was something promoted by Reb Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, and Americans in the audience, or maybe even non-Americans, will recognize his as the name for Yeshivat Reb Yitzchak Elchanan, Yeshiva University in New York. So the decision of the chief rabbinate 2 Shmitot ago still holds. Heter mechira, they said, will be used in Tafshin Ayin Hey, and it was used in Tafshin Pei Bet. It'll be minimized as much as possible. Each farmer has to participate individually. It's not that they say, we've sold all the land. No, you have to get a signature for each chelka, for each piece of land, and there's no wholesale version. Here's the heter mechira that was done 2 years ago. The buyer was somebody called Vasily Schmidt, and despite the name, he's absolutely not Jewish, but he is a Noachide. He observes the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, which is a lot harder than people realize. I don't know what the price was, but the down payment was 2,000 shekels. And if he did not pay pay the rest of the billions that he owed by the end of a certain period in the contract, then the land would revert back to the state of Israel. And this is the legal way of selling the land. In the previous heter mechira, there was somebody called George Streichman, who was a Noachide from Ramat Gan. Then I know that the price was 125 billion. He also put down 2,000 shekels. Here is this. I will point out that the heter mechira is not for personal gardens. It is only for larger wholesale tracts of land. It is not for your own personal 10-meter garden, unless you signed up for it, which is difficult to do. So much for who was for the heter mechira. Excuse me, please. I've made the bracha already. Famously, the Chazon Ish and his continuing posek, his nephew, Rav Nissim Karelitz, were against heter mechira. The Chazon Ish here is pictured visiting Kibbutz Chafetz Chaim just before the Shmita in the mid-1950s. He was one of the very few Gedolim who actually went out, puk chazeh, went out to take a look at what is happening. Although the Chazon Ish was short in physical stature, he was an absolute giant in halacha, and many people still go according to his piskei halacha, according to his judgment. Here's a picture of Rav Kook creating an otsar Beit Din under the eyes of his great uncle, who was not in favor of otsar Beit Din, but this is the way things proceed down the generations. How does this sort of thing work? Well, here is something. These are potatoes. They were planted before Rosh Hashanah. This picture was taken by me on the 5th of Tishrei, 5 days, actually 4 days after Rosh Hashanah. And there are some parts that are blank. What happens to anything that emerges there? Will that be considered to have been planted on Rosh Hashanah? Potatoes were placed there, but nothing came up. How do we know that they're growing? How do we know that we're not going to be growing something against halacha? Here's Rav David Stein of Rehovot. He and I went out together and we dug down into the furrows, and he found indeed the potatoes were already producing sprouts underground. They had not yet emerged, but by the size and shape of the sprouts, we knew that they had already begun their activity before Rosh Hashanah, and therefore we could use all the potatoes, even those that had not yet emerged or whose plants, whose leaves had not yet emerged from the ground. You have to know what you're doing in farming in order to observe halacha. In the case of things that are not sold according to heter mechira, we have to be deliberately imprecise in the weights. I said you can't weigh precisely, you can't measure precisely. It's not for us to deal with in a proper or in a seemingly proper economic, financial way. It's a distribution that we are doing. Here you see that there's 2 Shmitot to go. There was an extra 20% in the tirosh, in the grape juice from Carmel Mizrahi, and they were supposed to charge the same price as 1 liter. This was being deliberately imprecise. Here's a supermarket where it says that the wine has kedushat shvi'it, the sanctity of the 7th year, and you have to observe properly, not just spill the wine out, not cook with this wine, etc. I will point out that wine that comes from grapes that set in the 7th year in Shmita, in the 6 Shmitot that I have been in Israel, the wine of the Shmita year is always better than the year before it or after it. And in general, it's actually just good. There was one Shmita where that didn't really happen, but the vast majority of the time, and I've spoken to other people who are in the wine business, they say, yes, wine from Shmita tastes better. Nobody knows why. There is no physical, chemical, religious reason for it. Just you should know that that's the case. And here we see that it's an otsar Beit Din, we'll discuss that in a second, by the Rabbanut, and the wine has kedushat shvi'it. So let's talk about tree fruit that have Shmita sanctity. Actually, you observe 2 years of Shmita, 2, really. You care for the tree during Shmita, and then the fruit, as I have emphasized, has sanctity, but you're only going to get to the fruit, usually, in year 1 of the next cycle. Let's take a look at which fruit these are. In the 8th year, the Shmita fruit that's set during the 7th year, Shmita, apples, pears, tree nuts, not peanuts. Peanuts are a vegetable officially. Citrus. But we don't have to be concerned that something in the 8th year will have the sanctity of the 7th year, because it's usually off the market by Rosh Hashanah of year 8. Peaches, plums, nectarines, shesek, and bananas, which halachically are not a fruit. They are brachas, borei pri ha'adama. So the banana, instantly, when you harvest it after Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year, it is free of the sanctity of Shmita. You make your bracha borei pri ha'adama, and off you go. But what if you want to plant something before Shmita? How long before Shmita can you plant it? You can maintain the plant. Remember, you just can't plant during Shmita. So what is the time, an ordinary establishment? And Rambam says that for all fruit teas, it's 2 Shabbatot. that's 2 weeks. So if you plant 44 days before Rosh Hashanah, that works out halachically to be 1 year. But the netter revai fruit are only permitted after the 15th of Shvat, as we talked about when we were discussing Orla. So, what is your halachic math here? 14 days of tree establishment plus 30 days of growth for 1 month is 1 halachic year. Simple. So if you plant properly before Shmita, you cover 2/3 of the Orla years during Shmita. Because just before Shmita, you had halachically 1 year. Then during the Shmita year, it's another year. And it's not going to be producing much anyway. The 3rd year of Orla is the year after Shmita, the 1st year of the next cycle. And then we wait for Neter Revai, we wait until Tu B'Shvat of the 4th year. Any fruit that was produced then still has the status of Orla, and we can eat it after redeeming it. But if you were to plant improperly during Shmita, then you've really wasted your investment, because planting something during Shmita cancels its validity. Doesn't make a difference how much time you wait. The fruit is officially asur. This is if you have not done heter mechira, but these days in the state of Israel, I'm not aware of anybody, regardless of how they observe the mitzvot, who plants during Shmita, plants trees during Shmita. It's just not worth it for people not to want to buy from you years later because they know that you planted during Shmita. So what's our bottom line here? You can plant up to the 15th of Av of the 6th year for trees. You can plant up to the 26th of Elul, 3 days before Shmita. That's really the bare minimum, and 2 weeks would be better. And you can transplant containerized plants that are already growing up to candle lighting Erev Rosh Hashanah. You can maintain them afterwards. People always say, why don't we just do hydroponics? Well, it's good for some things. It's not connected to the land, that's true. But you can grow lettuce, you can grow herbs, but you can't grow potatoes like this. You certainly cannot grow enough wheat to make even 1 roll, and you need 2 of them on Shabbos. It's just not worth it for most produce. There are people who set up their greenhouses and they have an artificial substrate, and they are planting here, I believe it's peppers. And here it's one of the cole crops, it's some brassica here, possibly broccoli or cabbage. And they have set it up in a tunnel here so that it's not directly connected to the land. All of this is permitted during Shmita. Here is in Osher Ad, from their Tzomet Kanot, actually. And there it says, Hashgachat, the badatz of the Eda Charedit on all of the leafy greens is only when it says that it is Hashgacha of the Eda Charedit of Yerushalayim. Now, this was during Shmita, and Osher Ad was very, very well organized, to the extent that they even said that kuzbara, coriander, you're limited to buying 2 packages. Evidently, there was a shortage of kuzbara. Personally, I think that if you were limited to 1 package or even no packages, I would be perfectly happy also. But it turns out that actually there's a genetic quirk that makes you either like kuzbara or dislike kuzbara. So go do your 23andMe for kuzbara. You can use produce from the 6th year. Now, in the back here, we have potato sprouts, that it's a typhoon of potato sprouts there. Obviously, these potatoes will not be edible. The ones in the front are, and the sweet potatoes will be also. They're all being stored for a long time from the 6th year through the 7th year. There are experiments in the Volcani Center where I work, and they sprinkled mint oil, which burned the growing sprouts. Here they are untreated and they're sprouting. And here, every 2 months, they would give them a spritz of mint oil, and the potatoes stayed in perfectly good shape, and they did not taste like Crest or Colgate or any other toothpaste, not to worry, perfectly fine potatoes. On the other hand, I was involved in an experiment in storing carrots for a long time, and several treatments labeled here that were supposed to be excellent for storing carrots weren't. So here is the control, untreated, looks pretty good, a little bit of rot there. This is at around 5 months of storage. And here, with the treatment that's supposed to help, that wound up looking sort of like, I don't know, a 15-year-old yeshiva bacher who has decided to grow a beard. Sprouts are not grown connected to the land, and therefore they are going to be kosher, lemahadrin min mahadrin, even during Shmita. You can have frozen crops from the 6th year. You can have something that is grown officially in chutz la'aretz. Either these were imported from Europe, or they could have been grown in some place that is not halachically the land of Israel. Here's an explicit case, l'lo chsha shvi'it, yivul chutz la'aretz, arava dromit, the southern arava, or something that's stored from the 6th year, orange juice, or something that was grown, again, in chutz la'aretz, for the grapefruit juice here. Marketing has become more sophisticated over the past 6 Shmitot, and it will label it whether it's grown by a nochri, a non-Jew, or whether it's from the 6th year, or whether it was grown hydroponically. How can you buy things that have the sanctity of Shmita? We said that it's supposed to be distributed. Well, in an Otzar Beit Din, it would be distributed, but you have to pay the people who are actually doing the collecting from the various markets and the distributing at the various other markets at the retail level. Etrogim is a peculiar case. Nominally, you should only be paying, in an Otzar Beit Din, you should only be paying for the cost of production, which will include any chemicals needed, which will include irrigation, fertilizing if necessary, will include all the manpower needed both to harvest and to distribute and to store. Still, with the case of etrogim, prices will be 50 shekels or 100 shekels. I don't understand the halachic rationale. I am presenting it as a slight outlier. In any event, when you're buying your etrog that has kedushat shvi'it and you're purchasing it usually for Sukkot of the 8th year, just after Shmita, you're not really buying the etrog. You're actually buying the lulav. The lulav is a branch. It is not a fruit. It is not a vegetable. You can charge as much as you want for it. Officially, you are buying the lulav for your 100 shekels, and an etrog comes along with it. The price tag is on the etrog, however. This is called havla'ah, where the price of the thing that has kedushat shvi'it is swallowed in the price of something else. You could buy a kilo of apples plus a wastebasket to carry those apples in. You're actually paying for the wastebasket. Now, if you were to pay in cash, the money, the change that you get, the physical coins, the physical bills, will also get kedushat shvi'it. Your change will have kedushat shvi'it associated. You'll only be able to pay for things that have kedushat shvi'it with those coins. You would not be allowed to use it for something that doesn't have kedushat shvi'it. Thank God for credit cards. It turns out that the metallic strip, the magnetic strip, that's not considered metal like a coin. And therefore, since you're paying indirectly, then it's permitted to pay immediately with a credit card. And whenever the credit card pays, it pays, but you're not paying immediately, and therefore, la halacha, that's a permitted form of commerce with things that have kedushat shvi'it. We leave fields fallow sometimes. What if you leave them fallow? Remember the nematodes? We want to have that population crash. We worked on that. The Chazon Ish said if you change the regular sowing regime from crop rotation, a wheat and then a legume to enrich the soil, to use wheat after wheat, you want to keep the land from falling into the hands of non-Jews. We were talking about the 1950s, where people could actually squat on the land if they saw that it was not being used. He said, far better to keep the land in use and retain it for the Jews. We used no-till, we didn't plow, and weed killer. The next year, we had a very nice crop, because the water, but here where we didn't use weed killer, the weeds had drunk all the groundwater and we had a very bad crop. Another advantage of managing the land still with Ruach Shmita. Same thing with pruning vineyards. This guy here davens 5 times a day. He works with my former technician Shlomo Cohen. These are guys from the Rabbanut who came to show us how to prune a vineyard, not knowing that Shlomo and I were helping develop methods for doing just that. They tried to show us the method. Mundar over here looked over and said, oh, you guys are trying to show how to prune for Shmita? Let me show you. And he showed the method where it's not a complete cut. You cut a little bit and then you break it off. That's not considered pruning, and it is permitted on Shmita. Here is a vineyard operator, a farmer in Mabul Choron. Here is Rav Efrati. Here is Shlomo again. By the body language, you can tell that he's got a really serious question, and his answer is not going to be yes. And the question was, can we prune during Shmita? You usually prune grapevines in the wintertime. Obviously in Shmita, the pasuk says quite clearly, no, you can't. But if you prune when the leaves are still there, it's a very, very difficult task. And here are some experienced guys pruning, but they're only managing to do 50% of what they would have done if the leaves had fallen off. Worse yet, if you prune early, then the vine thinks that it's already wintertime and it starts leafing out, and it will not produce so many grapes. And we want those grapes. Remember, I said that the grapes will make good wine. Also, you want to have wine in general. One possible solution was using a robot, but it's a robot that somebody had to drive on. And ultimately, the halacha, the rabbis paskined that, no, you can't use this robot because it still required the intervention of people to direct it a little bit. It wasn't the harvesting, the pruning was not done at all by human intervention, but in order to turn it around, you needed human intervention, and that was considered directing it towards pruning, and this was considered not appropriate for Shmita. How do you know when something has Kedushat Shvi'it? Lists are put out. Lists for vegetables, lists for grains, lists for fruit, lists for legumes. As Moreno Rabbeinu Reb Velvel Gilbert said for the Mikado, I have a little list. It's a long list, and it will tell you when the beginning of Kedushat Shvi'it is, when the end of Kedushat Shvi'it is, when stuff stops appearing in the market, and you can generally manage your household, manage your kitchen, manage your dining room in light of heter mechira. Flowers, especially if they have a scent, also have Kedushat Shvi'it. As it says here, Yeshna Kedushat Shmita, ala Kashrut Shmita, ala Prachim. So these were grown either in a place where it was permitted to grow, could have been in a greenhouse, it could have been in a raised bed, it could have been someplace where the mitzvot of the land do not take place. And there are lists also of flowers. Which ones are perennials, so that you don't worry that the flower was planted or sown during Shemitah, and if it was pruned or not, and with and without scent. Generally, flowers with a scent have Kedushat Shvi'it, flowers without a scent don't. So here we are, the fruit are hefker, it says. Admission is only by permission. So the fruit do not belong to the owner, but the tree does, and the entrance to his house is still his. And the same thing with the car, you can't move it out of the way in order to get to his orange tree. So you need permission to harvest it, or he can harvest it himself and just leave it out for people to come and take it. But it's not a free-for-all. You can't just waltz right in, and take the fruit without permission. So what do we have here? We have the sanctity of Shemitah. It brings us closer to the land of Israel, the land with a capital L. It unites rich and poor people through the idea of forgiving debts, even though the mechanism now is that we don't forgive the debts, but there are some people who deliberately lend out money to give so that they don't have to ask for that loan back in order to be mekayim the mitzvah. Our ratio of spiritual to temporal matters should actually increase. We're thinking more about the sanctity of the land, the sanctity of the food that is grown in the land, and not so much about where is it, how much cheaper is it here, what can we do with it, etc. And of course, we get much better wine. And therefore, we will be even happier when we take the benefits of the sanctity of Shemitah, when we observe the mitzvot of Shemitah, and b'mehira b'yameinu, speedily in our days, when Mashiach comes, we will indeed be able to observe it technically and religiously and happily. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for ending with Shmita. We do have a question from Aviva regarding Klein from our previous session. And the question is, if you have herbs or vegetables and there's flowers growing around it, but very close, does this count as Klein?
The flowers, if they're not edible flowers, then no. Some flowers are edible. Some flowers, I should enunciate, are edible. But usually, it shouldn't be a thing. Consider also that the distance is probably that you need, the mandatory distance of halacha for the Klein would probably be only 15 centimeters. And if you have plants growing closer than that to your flowering bush, then you're not gardening properly, never mind observing the mitzvah. So it's not likely to be a halacha consideration.
Okay. Some say that Shmita is something that's good for the land. So the fact that we do something like heter mechira, doesn't that ruin the effect of giving rest to the land?
It does indeed. However, I mentioned that if you want to manage your insects or manage your anything that will harm, that's in the soil, that will harm your plants, then Shmita is good. There are many, many farms and farmers who, because of the economic necessity, will observe heter mechira, but they will leave a part of their land untouched, despite having sold it, observing Shmita with a part of their land. The question is, what is the purpose of Shmita? The benefit of Shmita could be managing your soil-borne pathogens. But the real benefit is observing the mitzvah that Hashem commanded us. That's the point. All the mitzvot are commanded by God. Many of them seem to have good reasons behind them. Thou shalt not kill, for example, or honor your father and mother, especially if you have children. You want to emphasize that one. But ultimately, the reward of a mitzvah is doing the mitzvah, and any other benefit is ancillary, comes along with it. So the observance of Shmita probably should be done, and many farmers, even if they use heter mechira, are aware of that, and therefore have a small part of their land that is still unsown, unplowed, etc.
Thank you very much, Josh. I think we all learned a lot from this series. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You're welcome to join us next Sunday. We'll be getting a different series, different topic with Dr. Nechemia Polin about an introduction to Chassidut. So thank you very much, and Besorot Tovot.